all EU buildings and homes climate neutral and energy efficient by 2050. Sounds great. And who doesn't want to have an eco-friendly, energy-efficient home? But as it stands, the onus is on homeowners, and each EU member state has a mixed bag. So we're asking if the green renovation wave is a utopia or a reality. To talk about these topics and much more, I'm joined here in our studio by Monique Goyen, the Secretary-General of BEUC. That's, of course, the European Consumer Organisation. We're also joined by Daniel Kruse, the German economist and the Director of the Centre for European Policy Studies, and also Silvia Ganzerla, the Policy Director at Eurocities. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we hear your thoughts and your insights, let's just remind our viewers what's at stake. Christopher Pitchers reports.
Bills, bread, butter. You name it, the price of everything is up. And for now, it's not coming down. The global pandemic, the climate crisis, and now the war in Ukraine have all created a perfect storm when it comes to the cost of everything we consume or purchase in our daily lives. But there is some good news. The European Commission's most recent projections for this year show that inflation is falling and is predicted to drop even further in 2024. The full impact of consecutive interest rate hikes supposed to restrain demand in order to cool inflation have also not been felt yet. For now, though, price increases remain stubbornly high. And as this cost of living crisis continues, the main concern of many people will be if it is really becoming too expensive to live.
Christopher Pitchers there. So I'll address that question to all of you, to our panel. Has the cost of living here in Europe gotten too expensive? Daniel Kruse, if you wouldn't mind starting, because you are an economist here around the table, and you've been, I think, very involved as well when the euro was created. You've been writing a lot of books as well about inflation and what it means for us.
We are unfortunately in a situation where there's very little we can do, we in Europe, to break the spiral of a increasing cost of living. And the main reason is it comes from abroad. It comes from higher energy and more material prices. And there we are now in a situation where things are pretty bad still, but getting better. The price of petrol coming down a little bit from the heights which we have seen last summer. And that's already useful for those who have a car and drive a lot. But it's still at a high level. And the same applies a bit to natural gas, which is essential for us to keep our homes warm and generate electricity. And there again, we have seen extraordinary prices last summer, 20 times higher than the past. And now they have coming down, but they're still 3 or 4 times higher than the past. So it's getting slowly better, but it's still pretty bad.
Okay, so in a nutshell, it's bad, but it's getting slowly better. In just a minute, we'll come to that spring economic forecast that the European Commission presented earlier this week. But first, let's get the take from the consumer organisation here, from Monique Goyen's, what you're seeing.
Yeah. First of all, it is really important to note that this is not a cost of living crisis that hits marginal segments of the population. It's really hitting a very important mass of people who have decent jobs. Families with 2 salaries that are being hit by this cost of living crisis. And it is true that we see that inflation rate might go down. However, this is not the end of the crisis, because this is not a single crisis we are going through. We are going through a multi-crisis. And the next crisis to come is the climate. I mean, it's already there, but that will hit us even more if we don't act. Is the climate change crisis, and therefore we really need our governments to address the cost of living crisis in a visionary, smart way, by addressing also at the same time the climate change crisis. And that's a challenge that we really expect governments to take up in the coming months and weeks and years.
And caught in the middle, of course, of national governments are the cities from across Europe. And you're from Eurocities, representing 200 cities from across the continent. How are you foreseeing the situation now? Has it just gotten too expensive to live?
Well, definitely, it has been gone very expensive. We see rising, worrying trends of prices going up. It's about food, it's about energy, bills, cost of housing, transport, access to services. And at the moment, people that were vulnerable are becoming even more vulnerable, and the middle class is becoming vulnerable. So it's nice to see that there are some more positive outlooks for the economy, but the question is this going to trickle down to the people? And we are now putting in place some short-term measures, but we should think about more long-term measures to tackle the crisis. Because at the moment what we're seeing is the middle class that is becoming poor. We have a new number of people, raising number of people that we can define working poor. So we had the shock of the COVID pandemic, which put at risk many people with precarious contracts, and they are still paying from that crisis. And then the invasion of Ukraine just exacerbated everything.
Okay, so
Can I add
gloomy
something
outlook.
to that?
Absolutely, yeah, Monica.
Because it's not only the inflation, it's also what is very important is to check how markets are behaving, because there are a lot of price increases that have no justification. And this is something where we believe governments should or authorities should enforce with teeth. They should really tackle unfair marketing practices. There are some of the food price increases that are not at all justified by the inflation.
Well, this is why we're talking about this concept of shrinkflation. I was reading an article earlier this week about inflation in Poland, which is huge, and people are going to the supermarket, according to this article, with a magnifying glass to make sure that there's 10 tissues in the box of tissues they're buying and not 8, because seemingly consumers are being tricked in the last couple of months due to this crisis. Is this something you've noted, Daniel Gross? Shrinkflation?
Not really yet at a large scale. I think it is true that whenever we have high price increases, some not very scrupulous producers try to trick consumers by changing slightly the amount of the good they put into a package and so on. But overall, there's just no escape when inflation, when energy prices go up and other raw material prices go up that we have to import. There's less to be distributed overall for our entire economy. So when governments promise nobody will suffer, that's wrong, because somebody has to pay the price. Now, a good government would make sure that the better off pay more and those at the bottom are protected. That sounds easy to say and to ask for, but the difficulty lies in actually doing it and implementing it. Like, for example, the German government tried last year to say, okay, we will protect only consumers which have a moderate consumption and have a low income. And then they turned to the electricity companies and says, we don't have that information. We can't do it, right? So it takes some time to have smart policies in place.
And as Sylvia was saying earlier as well, politicians do not think long term. A quick comment from you, and then I want to talk about the Eurogroup that happened this week.
About the...
Do you have a quick reaction there to what Daniel Gross was saying?
Well, yes, of course, it is true that in fact, you should be counterintuitive. You should discriminate as a government. You should really focus on helping the poorer households. All of us have received a voucher to pay our energy bill. We didn't need it. Bring that money to those who really need it. That's really important.
That's just a populist measure, right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, everybody, of course, we are all happy to get that money or to have this reduction of our energy bill, but we should really be able to help those who need it most. That's what fiscal justice is about.
Yeah. That's what fiscal justice is about. Sylvia?
Yeah, if I can mention something about the more long-term vision that we need to take, it's very clear that at local level investments has gone down since the economic crisis of 2008 and has gone down a lot in social infrastructure. We really need to put in place new instruments to make sure that the local level can reinvest in social infrastructure such as affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, education. This is essential to help people to be out of a poverty cycle.
And I don't think that was discussed this week when EU finance ministers met here in Brussels. They discussed, of course, the economy. They discussed the energy crisis of the last 18 months. And fronting their meeting was Pascal Donoghue. Pascal Donoghue is the president of the Eurogroup, and he said the mood in that meeting with finance ministers was slightly confident but still cautious. We can take a listen.
Compared to where we were last summer, energy prices have come down significantly, and the most pessimistic forecasts have not materialised. However, prices do remain at high levels. More broadly, risks clearly remain and have to be monitored very closely, and there's no room at all for complacency. Developments with regard to demand and storage have been reassuring, but we need to continue with our efforts to diversify our energy sources and to reduce energy consumption.
That was Pascal Donoghue there, the head of the Eurogroup. I don't know if you all tuned in to that press conference or have any quick reaction to what he's been saying.
I think the fears of a gas shortage were really overstated, exaggerated. Because in most countries, at least, consumers are paying higher prices, they're consuming less. And that has helped us getting through the winter with still high storages. That is also what brings down, in the end, the prices, not to the previous level, but much closer to the previous level. And that is something which I think we should have learned, that when there is an unavoidable adjustment to something which is unpleasant, high energy prices, we have to do it. And if we do it, actually, we can pull through much easier than if we try to give consumers the illusion nothing has changed, you can get the same cheap energy as before.
Yes, and I would like to say also that you said somebody has to pay at the end of the day, and all this help, this support that is being given is putting pressure on public funds. And at the end of the day, we will all have a problem with access to medicines that are affordable, the fact healthcare in general, education. So all the social services will maybe have a drawback there because the money is not there anymore in the public budgets. So we really need to have this long-term vision where investments are being made for a sustainable future.
Yeah. And Sylvia?
Yes, just to follow up on what Daniel said, I would like to mention that we have many examples of cities that set up advisory board to help citizens to understand how to save energy, because this is crucial. And giving the illusion that you can have subsidies to pay your bills is just a very short-term measure. We need to raise awareness with citizens on what to do to bring down the energy consumptions, and that's not easy, because when we go to school we learn how meters and the kilogram, but when we look at the energy consumptions, I just wonder how many people really understand those measures.
Well, in just a minute I want to ask you which countries are the most expensive in the European Union. But first, I'd like to ask you, did you notice that the ECB, the European Central Bank, have increased interest rates by 0.5% to fight inflation? Daniel Gross, you're the economist. Are central bankers in panic mode, do you think?
No, not really in panic mode, but they confront a situation which they haven't seen for 20, 30 years. Inflation which is high. So they're saying, okay, we take the good old measures which we had from the past and apply them.
But shouldn't they have done it earlier?
Let's say they should have, right? Okay, one can say with hindsight, everybody. But I think the central bankers, they had built up very elaborated models over the last 20 years when there was no inflation. And those models told them there will be no inflation because there hasn't been any. Okay, and it took a couple of months or almost a year before they understood these models are no longer useful. They've put them aside.
Okay.
But really, when we have high energy prices, there's very little the central bank can do.
Okay, and Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, was of course in Strasbourg earlier this week addressing all those issues to members of the European Parliament. But now, as I said, I would like to ask you, do you know which country is the most expensive in Europe, Sylvia?
I think it's hard to say because it really depends on, it should take into account the level of salary and the measures that have been put in place to mitigate inflation. And then, coming from Eurocities, I would challenge a question. Should we look at how expensive cities are, because national statistics sometimes are not providing the correct information about what happened in big cities, and the picture can be very different.
Well,
maybe what I could say is maybe the expensiveness is not necessarily the criterion for the crisis and how the crisis hits the people. What we see is that people who live in houses that are less well insulated are suffering most because they pay the highest price. And most of the time it's in those countries where the purchase power is the lowest. So that's
a topic we'll come back to a little bit later. But now let's just take a look, because of course, as we've said, the cost of living is going up all across Europe. But in some countries, it was already very, very expensive. In Denmark, for example, it's the country that, according to our source, numbeo.com, is the most expensive at the moment. Then Luxembourg, and coming in third, Ireland, then France and the Netherlands. I mean, is it becoming affordable, Daniel Gross, to to visit these countries as a tourist or as a student if you want to study there and rent a house?
Effectively, as a student, as a tourist, they're expensive. If you live there and get the Danish, Luxembourgish or Irish salary, you're doing fine. Actually, on that front, Bulgaria and Romania are more expensive.
Yeah.
More expensive for the local population. A haircut costs, I don't know, 1/3 in Sofia than in Luxembourg. But since the salaries are even less than 1/3, this present situation is much more difficult for these poorer countries where they have less well-insulated housing and where before the energy prices were subsidized, now the governments don't have the money, and so they're going up by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4. So these countries are really much harder hit than Luxembourg or Denmark.
And just on housing, we were taking a look at some figures as well to see what the situation is regarding housing inflation. And it seems like in Estonia, it's peaked at 24.2%, in Spain, 7.6%, and here in Belgium, 5.4%. And house prices as well have jumped, according to Eurostat, by 6.8 in the euro area and 7.4 last year. These are overwhelming figures for our viewers there to digest. Monique Goyen.
Yes, indeed, and there also we believe that there must be again made a link with energy efficiency, and for example, tenants should be protected against increase in rents when the house is not well insulated. This has been adopted in Belgium, in some of the regions of Belgium, so you should be protected against rent increases, for example, if there is no energy efficiency along the way.
And at Eurocities, how have you seen this impacting the quality of life in cities across the continent?
Yeah, even before this crisis, we had issue of affordability in big cities, especially because the costs of housing have always been very high. Clearly, the amount of money you have to pay for your house, including the expenses, takes a big part of your salary. And this is something that is not always factored in when we look at the statistics about how expensive is a city or how expensive is a country. So it's very, very important because we need to have housing that are well insulated for health reasons. We also need to have a housing that have enough space for people to live in. And we also see a worrying trend of increasing rents. And the issue of eviction is also coming up a lot.
That's a topic. That's a topic for another day.
Rising trend of people that are at risk of homelessness.
We'll come back to that topic another day. Daniel Gross, just a final comment from you on that spring economic forecast that the European Commission presented this week. It was the data they presented, and they said we just narrowly avoided a recession. What's your message to our viewers who are looking there going, where are we going?
I think the economy is doing pretty well. But like a European economy, it doesn't grow massively, right? But it trucks along at a moderate pace. And we avoided an energy crisis because everybody of us saved a little bit. And from here onwards, I think we should be positive. Yeah.
Okay, another good news. Unemployment in the EU has also reached a record low. That's another figure we were looking at this week. But that's all we have for this topic. But do stay with us. In just a minute, we'll be looking at the EU's plans to green our homes by 2050. See you soon on Euronews and Euronews.com.
I'm so scared.
Why are you scared?
Italia se muere de sed. La situación es especialmente dramática.
Being here is just chilling.
Und die Menschen haben Angst vor diesem Wasser.
Refugees arrive at any moment.
La prossima edizione del notiziario tra meno di 2 minuti su Euronews.